Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is your program that brings news, views, updates, and insight into the religious liberty situation in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on this program is my son, Christopher Steed, still a teenager, a young man, and I've got you here for a reason. Not just, if it was just a matter of emotion, I could have you on every program, son. That'd be, any dad would like that. But, you know, we're always concerned to show and to illustrate that young people can move in and understand religious liberty and become activists for religious liberty. So you're a good stand-in for your whole generation. But as far as this program, let's talk a little bit about the United States. You know, my accent gives me away. There's a story in the Old Testament where between the tribes of Israel there was a dispute, bloody dispute, and they wanted to find the enemy, and so they would have them say a certain word, and if they mispronounced it slightly, which one side would always do, then they would cut their head off. And I'm a bit like that. I hope I don't lose my head, but I always betray my Australian origins by my accent. But you're local born and bred. Even though I know emotionally you connect very well to Australia. But, you know, let's talk about the United States. This is the land of the home of the free and the brave, right? That can be true. That can be true of any country. What do you think really characterizes the United States to set it apart? And every country is unique in its own way, but what are the claims to fame of the United States?
I remember going back on a history class. I remember one of my history professors back when I was actually in public school at this time, and he said, the United States, in my opinion, one of my favorite things about the United States is how it's a melting pot for all people, of all religions, all colors, all whatever you want. It's everybody's here. You can go to Walmart and see people from India, China, Japan, Russia, Germany, even Antarctica. I mean, I've noticed it even now, traveling with my father a lot, traveling with my family. I mean, even in school, traveling with the choirs. Going to different churches and seeing how many different people are in those churches. I mean, even in my hometown of Hagerstown, I'm walking through Walmart and I'm seeing Muslim ladies dressed in the full burqas. I'm seeing Sikh fathers with their little boys with their headgear on, and I see that as like the U.S.'s claim, I guess you can say, claim to fame, of how it's just a melting pot for every person and every religion, every way of life.
That's true. It's not unique to the US, but I think as it came into being, it was more unique than now. Like Australia's a more recent country, and as you know, it's fairly, and certainly since World War II, become a real melting pot of all different cultures. Brazil was one that comes to mind that's pretty multicultural. But when the US was formed, that was a rather unusual sort of of an idea where all the different groups, some religious, some entrepreneurial, and from Holland and France and England and Germany, you can sort of see, you know, you and I, we're very aware of Pennsylvania nearby. There's the Deutsch.
Pennsylvania Dutch.
The Deutsch, it's the Deutsch, the Germans.
The Germans.
There's German areas, and then the Scandinavians up in Minnesota. Yes, I think that has been a characteristic of the US. But more than that, it's, in my view, it's that this was all subsumed, that's probably a word you haven't used, into a general Americanism. This late point, I don't think they think that they're Germans or whatever. Yeah. And to be America is not necessarily an ethnic thing or any particular culture. I mean, Mum and apple pie, you know, is American, but you know, might be apple pie, cheesecake, or pumpkin pie. But I don't think it's any of those things. It's just sort of a shared vision, isn't it? Of freedom, Unfortunately, part of it was, manifest destiny.
I remember hearing about it.
This was sort of a view that they twisted from the early Puritans, that it was God's sort of charter for them to take over the whole continent. And I think now it's going a little further, take over the whole world. Some of the Christian right have a sort of a global view as to why Israel is on our view and so on. But I think America is a country that has a sense of destiny more than most, doesn't it?
I think so, yes. I see America as a place where people come to not only start their new lives, but as well as to better themselves. Like, I have a friend, I believe she told me it was her grandfather moved to the U.S. From, I believe, somewhere either in the Middle East or Europe. In Europe, he was not a wealthy family. Came to the U.S., went to school, got his degrees, and I believe his civil engineering. Now her grandfather's retired, her father's taken over, and he's one of the top NASA people, just because his father came from another country and he decided to create his own living here. And it's the land of opportunities.
And it's been so for a lot of people. Do you think religion has played a role in this sense of opportunity and a sense of destiny? I
do see it, and pulling this back into religious liberty, how we have here in the United States, we have all religions from every corner of the world worshiping all in the same country. And I mean, in some countries, like in China, I know it's strictly Buddhist. Or in North Korea.
Well, Confucianism
in China.
In every country there are sprinklings of all religions, but there is a monolithic religious, cultural identity in many countries, yes.
But in the U.S., it's every religion has its right to worship.
It's always granted that, but it's worth remembering that as a fact of history, other than very few pockets, and interestingly, one is near where you and I live, around Baltimore. America was a Protestant culture. When in the Louisiana Purchase, you remember that? You studied that part of history. What was that?
It was when they purchased Louisiana from, I believe it was the French.
Yeah, well, that Louisiana Purchase under Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, pretty much doubled the size of the U.S., and that would have brought in quite a lot of Catholics, the French Catholics in Mississippi and places like that. But there's no question that still, overall, this was a Protestant sensibility in the United States. Even the Constitution, with the separation of church and state and its religious freedom from all, it's a civil construct, not a religious government, but it really derived from a Protestant view of freedom that was hard-earned. And there was a deep suspicion of the old problems with Catholicism and the blending of church and state. And even something as nefarious as the Ku Klux Klan, which has largely disappeared now, or we hope it doesn't reappear. They weren't just racist and violent. They were aiming at a white Christian America. And they were persecuting often Catholics and Jews just as violently and aggressively as they were blacks. And that's not to be endorsed in any shape, form, or manner. It just illustrates the perception that this was a Protestant country. Well, we've moved with the times, and I think the principle of religious liberty can apply, not can, should apply to Roman Catholics, Muslims, anyone. And I'll test you again. I don't think you know the answer to this. Have you heard of the Treaty of Tripoli?
I've heard you talk about it.
You've heard me talk.
You've been giving me, as we drive or as we fly or when we traveling, you've given me blips of history lessons, and yeah. I remember you hearing you mention it once or twice, but I don't remember exactly what it is.
Well, that was the first foreign treaty that the U.S. had, and it followed on from really the first foreign war, because it was under George Washington's presidency. And it was settled under President Adams, but the U.S. didn't have a navy to speak of, and as they sent ships into Europe, into the Mediterranean, an area known as the Barbary Coast which included Tripoli and which is modern-day Libya, there were pirates, Islamic pirates, that were going out and were sinking the ships and taking prisoners, and they would either keep them as slaves or hold them for ransom. And America just couldn't deal with this, so they built a navy to go fight the Barbary Pirates, and it was rather an inconclusive fighting. I've got a book on it that's recently come out. I wish I could remember the name, but anyone could go to a bookstore and ask for the latest book on the Barbary Pirates. It's most interesting. Like it tells the story there of Adams and Jefferson, both government functionaries, not yet presidents. They sat down with the ambassador for Tripoli, and they said, you know, we don't want you to take these captives and these slaves anymore. You know, American slaves? Because as they were talking, at one stage, as the U.S. ambassador rather was talking to the ruler of Tripoli, there was a Christian slave waving a white American Christian slave waving the cooling fan over his head. It's almost unbelievable that this was going on at that time. And you know what the guy's answer to them was, the ambassador? He says, well, my holy book says that I can enslave non-Muslims. And he says, that's just fine with me. So America had to form a navy. They fought them a bit. The least showed them that America's not to be trifled with. And they signed a treaty called the Treaty of Tripoli. And very tellingly, it says there that America is not founded on any religion, and it is just as much a country for Muslims and Christians and Hindus and all the rest. And so it was a secular country, there's no question. But it was a Protestant culture. And I believe that its secular government exemplified Protestant views of freedom of religion and open practice. And so you've inherited a pretty good history in this country, right?
I have.
So how do you think that as an American we can keep these freedoms going?
Well, right now, I see, as an American citizen myself, you know, religious freedom, freedom to speak, as long as it's nothing that condemns violence or racist bigotry or anything like that. I mean, these freedoms are given to us as in the Constitution and in other documents. And I believe that, you know, each president should hold those truths to be as they are. Truths.
Self-evident.
Self-evident, yes.
Yeah, self-evident. So in other words, stay by our founding principles, not change them. And I wish I could remember what founding father, but he says if you take away liberties according to the emergency of the moment, he says those that take them away for a momentary safety deserve neither safety nor freedom. Because it's precisely at the moment of danger and of threat that a good principle protects you. You don't change the principle when it gets dangerous.
Yep.
And we're still in the middle of that testing time, aren't we? You were born before 2001, but not much before. But most of your life has been after the Twin Tower of 9/11, Twin Towers coming down. And legally, many, many things have changed, and attitudes toward religious freedom have changed. Not in good ways always.
No, not always.
Let's take a break, come back. We'll come back after 9/11 and pick it up. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break with guest Christopher Steed, we were musing about on the role of the U.S. in history and its self-perception, and we'd arrived at the big moment, September 11, 2001. So many things changed. At the very least, if you look at it as a point of history, it was a marker. There's before, like, the influence of Christianity is undeniable in history. It's before Christ and after Christ, Anno Domini. But for the U.S., I think it's before 9/11 and after 9/11. And so many of our laws, while they weren't openly changed, they were modified in dangerous ways that really don't give us the freedoms that we imagine we have. Do you remember 9/11 at all?
I remember bits of it. I mean, I've heard stories from when I was little, some embarrassing.
Well, the
some
one that I
not.
want to tell, I was giving you the chance to tell of your thoughts when you were, what, 2.5, not much older. We tried to keep it from you, as many parents. It was shocking to see it on TV, and I can't remember letting you see it, but it was everywhere, so you must have seen something. And I remember once you were in your car seat at the back, in the back of the car, you know, the child seat where you buckled in and all the rest, and the window was down. It must have been, I don't know why the window's down, because, or maybe you rolled it down. And as we stopped at the lights, you called across to the car opposite us. You says, "There's buildings been falling and people dying and all the rest."
I don't remember that one.
And this little kid could barely talk. It's bubbling out that this has happened. We thought, this is amazing. He wants to tell people. But there's no question it was a shock to the whole world, but particularly to the US, which imagined and still thinks that it's largely immune to outside attack. We go and fight wars elsewhere, but for them to come here, it couldn't be, but it was. And so something that I want to repeat here for our viewers, because I just read it again the other day. But at the time I read in Harper's Magazine an article that quoted from a then recent issue of Le Monde magazine in Paris, France. A psychologist or a social scientist was writing about it, and he said the event was not just real and the violent and the visceral disaster that we all saw. He says, if it had just been real, you know, we see killing on the news accounts, and of course movies, gratuitous killing, and we see videos from World War II and the Holocaust and so on. We're sort of immune to that. He says, violence in its excess can become sort of banal, commonplace, can't it?
It can.
You get used to it.
I mean, nowadays with like the new video games that have been coming out, I go to GameStop at the mall sometimes, and
I've gone with you.
I mean, I've looked at some of the games there, even the demo games. I mean, there was one, I believe it's I don't remember the full title, but it's Advanced Warfare, and you go through. It's like basically a war simulation game, and you just blow people's heads off.
Now, that's very bad on its own level, because there's other studies showing that desensitizes young people particularly to violence against other people. But you're right. It's all around us, isn't it? And this fellow in his article said, he says, violence can be sort of banal. He says, no, it was worse than real. It was symbolic. And in these great towers, symbol of our technology, of our civilization that was, you know, we see it as bigger and better than most, if not all, and see it just collapsing down. That is a terribly debilitating moment. Then later in the article he said something, I think I can remember the sequence, phenomenal. He says, we have reached the point when the idea of freedom itself, an idea relatively recent and new, is in the process of fading away and being replaced by its polar opposite, that of a terror of security. And that's really what's happening. And as that happens, I see true religious freedom becoming a victim of this new dynamic. That in a security state, we can't afford unrestricted religious liberty. The free market of spiritual ideas, and me talking to someone else, and like you were saying earlier, talking to someone in the parking lot about your Adventist faith, that could more easily be seen as potentially dangerous in a post 9/11 world. Do you think?
I mean, yeah. I mean, talking in a group. I mean, one-on-one talking, I wouldn't see it as a potential danger. But I mean, talking like getting a secret group together in a house. I mean, I could see that as a potential danger, but just talking in a parking lot, I mean, yes, people would see that as a danger, but at the same time, I wouldn't consider it as a threat to security.
Yeah. None of us know quite the future. Many people fear, and I know you've heard talk about martial law in the US.
I have.
Which has happened before. One of the hurricanes down Florida, I think in the 1930s. They declared that whole state under martial law. And I don't know how many they killed, but it was in order to shoot looters on sight, for example. That's martial law. And usually curfews, you're not allowed after a certain time, keep to your house or else you're arrested or worse. But as we discussed it in our day, it's more of a national or a generalized martial law. And I think there's plenty of evidence that such a thing would happen if we had another 9/11. And who knows? You know, there's plenty of bad players that would like to do something like that again.
But they're scared, probably. Well, I wouldn't say scared. I'd say they're intimidated.
That's the idea of the military. They're trying to intimidate them, of course. But back to what you said, Christopher, meeting in the home. How would you think that religion and religious worship would be carried on at a time of martial law?
I think religion and religious worship should be carried on, in homes, but as well in each person's life. Like, I know the Bible says where two or more are gathered, I am there. And
don't forsake the gathering of yourselves together, yeah.
And I mean, you would for example, I know I've heard stories from friends who've been missionaries of meeting in a home where people will come in or writing a letter to a relative and like putting a Bible verse in it. I mean, you can still worship like that, but worshiping together, it gives a sense of community and a sense of, I can rely on these people. Like if let's say I run out of food, I have this community where I am, where I can go to my neighbor and say, look, I ran out of, I need flour. Would you be willing? And so worshiping in the home would give you that sense of a community.
You're right, and you've picked on something that we've never spoken about here before, but I've thought about it before, that a religious community is a support structure. And the New Testament says they had all things in common and they cared first for the widows and the orphans within their group. Now you think about martial law. Most people don't understand how it works. There are several things that they do. There is a curfew, a time when you're not allowed out of your house. And then one of the most important things is they restrict large gatherings of people. Now, a church service, by definition, is a large gathering of people. Now, I don't think for a minute, if the US military declared martial law, that they would restrict, say, Baptist, Episcopal, Catholic gatherings. But then you get down to some others. Would they restrict Jehovah's Witnesses? Would they restrict Muslims? Probably.
Most likely.
Would they restrict a little offshoot group? Like there was one recently, the guy publicly burned a Quran as an act of provocation, or others that attend military funerals and called them murderers and all the rest. The government easily sees that as disruptive. Would they allow Seventh-day Adventists who have an apocalyptic end-time view? Would they allow us to meet? Right? So there's a good chance that some churches, and perhaps even ours, wouldn't be allowed to meet regularly in a time of martial law. Well, that's very bad. Now, you've suggested meet in the homes. But in a martial law, you're in exactly the same thing because they restrict the number of people that can meet together. It's usually very small, 5 or 10.
I mean, even then, those 5 or 10 people, then the next day, those 5 or 10 people could have meetings in their homes.
Well, you're right.
And have different people.
Yeah, there you go.
And then those 5 or 10, like during the week, each person, like in a small village, I'm thinking, like, let's take Hagerstown, for example. Let's take our community. We could have a meeting at our house, let's say this weekend. We'll take, let's say they limit the people in our house to 10 people. So there's us 4, well now 3 because Kristen's gone and out in school. So 3 of us plus as many
Very good thinking, son, and I have great hope. It's through the intercommunication and networking that a faith can be carried on. And in spite of what I said, that they likely would restrict certain churches and maybe ours, and that could be the real threat of something like martial law, true faith can carry on, can't it?
I believe true faith, no matter what the situation, will always be able to carry on, will be able to push through. I mean, we'll be able to get through anything that you put up against it.
President George Bush Jr. once went on the public airwaves and said that God had blessed America and he couldn't have blessed more deserving people. I think his intention was good, but the dynamic was a little mixed up. But there's no question, when you look at the history of the United States as it moved into the modern era, from its first beginnings, which were not all religious, but included many people escaping religious persecution, and then the Constitution protecting, through the separation of church and state, the practice of religion. There is no question that the United States has been used in a fairly unique way to protect freedom of expression and freedom of religion. I know all of us would pray that this continue. This is a time of revolution and things being overturned and freedoms restricted. But for the United States, let freedom ring. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.